The Pacific Ocean stretched wide and endless, a mirror of blue hiding the shadows of empires preparing to collide. It was May 1942, and the tide of war had turned the world into a furnace. Japan had conquered vast swathes of the Pacific, its red rising sun blazing over territories once thought untouchable. The Allies were reeling, their lines stretched thin, their morale tested by defeat after defeat. Yet beneath the surface, in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, something was stirring, a quiet resolve that would soon erupt into fire. Aboard the American carriers USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, the air was thick with anticipation. Sailors cleaned their rifles, pilots studied maps lit by flickering lamps, and the smell of oil and salt hung heavy in the humid air. Every man knew what loomed ahead. The Imperial Japanese Navy was advancing toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. If it fell, Australia could be next. The stakes were higher than ever imagined. The Japanese called their plan Operation MO, a calculated strike designed to sever Allied lines of defense. Their fleet, led by seasoned Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, moved swiftly through the Pacific, supported by elite carrier forces under Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. To them it was another step in Japan's unstoppable march across the ocean. To the Americans it was the last chance to halt that momentum before it devoured the entire region. Far below deck, machinists worked tirelessly to keep the engines alive. The rhythmic hum of turbines echoed through metal corridors, punctuated by the distant clatter of tools and the bark of officers issuing orders. On the flight decks, mechanics prepped the deadly birds of war, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBD Devastators and F-4F Wildcats, each marked with fresh fuel, bombs secured, and bullets loaded into belts. In the Pacific night, the horizon seemed infinite, but every man aboard those carriers knew the enemy was out there, beyond the dark waves. Somewhere over the sea, Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku hunted them. The battle that awaited would not be fought with cannon and steel, but with wings and courage. In Tokyo, Japanese planners believed the Allies were too weak to respond effectively. They had underestimated one thing: American resolve. Intercepted codes, thanks to Allied cryptanalysts working tirelessly at Pearl Harbor, had given Admiral Chester W. Nimitz critical insight into Japan's intentions. He responded by ordering Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to intercept the Japanese fleet in the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, two carrier groups would face each other without their ships ever exchanging direct gunfire. As dawn broke on May 1st, the calm before the storm settled over the Pacific like a shroud. In the mess hall of the Yorktown, men spoke in hushed tones. "You think this is the big one sailor asked, tracing a trembling finger over the coffee cup's rim. His companion, a wiry mechanic named Daniels, nodded. "Feels like it. But hell, if we don't stop them here, there won't be anywhere left to stand." At the same time, across the ocean, Japanese pilots cleaned their goggles and adjusted their flight suits. The discipline of the Imperial Navy was unmatched, efficient, precise, and absolute. To them, the war was sacred, their duty unquestioned. The air groups trained relentlessly for this moment, unaware that American intelligence already knew their destination. As Task Force 17 advanced through the sea lanes, lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, the salty wind biting their faces. "Nothing yet, sir," one called down from the tower, "but she's out there." Every man could feel it, the predator's breath on the back of the neck, the silent tension before the kill. The sea became a chessboard. Each admiral maneuvered in the vast emptiness, guessing, probing, hoping to strike first. For 4 days, reconnaissance planes darted between clouds, searching for a glimpse of the enemy. Sometimes they returned with only ocean reflections and cloud shadows. Other times, they didn't return at all. On May 3rd, Japanese forces struck first, not at the carriers, but at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. They landed troops and quickly overran the small Allied garrison. But their triumph was short-lived. American reconnaissance spotted the invasion fleet, and Fletcher's carriers launched a swift counterattack. At dawn on May 4th, American aircraft screamed over Tulagi's harbor. Bombs fell like rain. Japanese destroyers erupted in fire as smoke billowed across the islands. The attack sank or damaged several enemy ships, sending a clear message: the Allies would not yield. Yet Fletcher knew this was only the beginning. The main Japanese carrier force had yet to be found. Intelligence suggested they were moving south, preparing to cover the Port Moresby invasion. Fletcher repositioned his task force, his ships slicing through restless waters. Every decision was weighed against the unknown. One wrong move could mean annihilation. The men aboard the Lexington called her Lady Lex, a ship that carried both pride and fear. In her hangars, pilots lounged on crates, smoking cigarettes and waiting for orders that might seal their fate. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, a veteran flyer, wrote a brief letter home before takeoff. "Tell Mary I'm fine. If I don't make it, tell her I went down doing my job." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of countless others like him, men caught between duty and dread. On May 5th, the weather turned rough. The Coral Sea grew restless, waves crashing against hulls with relentless fury. Rain drummed on metal decks as lightning carved brief silhouettes of ships in the darkness. Still, the men prepared. The air crackled with expectation. Tomorrow, they believed, the enemy would come. That night, beneath the storm's roar, Admiral Fletcher stood on the bridge of the Yorktown, staring into the black horizon. Around him, the ship pulsed with life, the hum of engines, the chatter of the radio, the footsteps of officers. He knew what lay ahead would not only decide the fate of his fleet, but the direction of the entire Pacific War. "We'll meet them out there," he murmured, "and we'll show them the sea belongs to no empire." As dawn rose on May 6th, the rain cleared, revealing a sky streaked with crimson. It looked almost prophetic, the ocean reflecting blood-red light, as if the world itself anticipated the carnage to come. From both sides, scouts took off once more, their engines roaring as they climbed into the pale light of morning. The hunt was about to end. The storm had gathered. The Coral Sea, quiet and infinite, was about to ignite with the fury of nations. May 7, 1942. Dawn broke over the Coral Sea with the deceptive calm of a painted horizon. Beneath the crimson light, the Pacific looked serene, gentle waves shimmering under the rising sun. But beyond that stillness, war was waiting to be unleashed. In the distance, two great fleets hunted one another, invisible yet destined to collide in a storm of metal, flame, and fate. On the American carrier Yorktown, the air crews awoke before first light. Engines coughed to life, sending vibrations through the steel decks, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt and sweat. Pilots strapped themselves into their cockpits, the rhythmic clack of harness buckles echoing down the hangar. Above, deck crews moved like ghosts through morning mist, guiding the planes into position for takeoff. Commander William B. Ault, the Lexington's air officer, reviewed final attack plans under the dim glow of a lamp. His eyes betrayed exhaustion, but burned with purpose. "Today," he told his men, "we hit them first, or we don't come back." Meanwhile, far over the horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved with the precision of a machine. Admiral Takagi's carrier force, Shokaku and Zuikaku, was still searching for the Americans, unaware that both sides were sending out scouting planes at the same time. The sea had become a vast labyrinth of deceit, radio silence, and chance. At 7:22 a.m., a Japanese scout spotted what it thought was an American carrier group. In truth, it was the oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, detached from Fletcher's main fleet. Believing they had found the enemy's heart, Japanese pilots launched their full strike force, 78 aircraft, roaring into the morning sky. Their engines tore through the clouds like thunder. Back aboard the Lexington, radar operators picked up incoming blips, though distant. "They found something," an officer murmured, unaware that the Japanese were flying toward the wrong target. Hours later, as the Americans launched their own strike groups to search northward, the trap was accidentally reversed. At 8:15 a.m., one of the American scout planes sighted the light carrier Shoho, a smaller ship guarding the Japanese invasion force bound for Port Moresby. The call came through the radio, electric with excitement. "Enemy carriers sighted! Position 1005 south, 15236 east." The response from Lexington's air commander was simple, almost ritualistic. "Scratch one flat top." Within minutes, American aircraft filled the skies. Dive bombers and torpedo planes climbed through layers of cloud, the sunlight flashing off their wings. The radio channels crackled with nervous chatter and clipped commands. "Maintain formation. Watch your spacing. Godspeed, boys." As the first wave descended upon the unsuspecting Shoho, chaos erupted. The carrier's lookout spotted black dots against the sun. Too late. Sirens screamed across the deck. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled into position, firing into the blinding sky as the first bombs fell. The sea exploded around her in geysers of water and flame. A dauntless dive bomber released its payload from 10,000 feet. Seconds later, it struck the flight deck dead center, igniting fuel lines and detonating munitions below. In a matter of minutes, the Shoho was engulfed in fire. Her decks buckled, smoke pouring into the heavens. Pilots aboard the attacking aircraft could feel the heat through their cockpit glass as they pulled away, circling to witness the inferno below. One American aviator, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, sent back a now immortal transmission. "Scratch one flat top, Shoho is burning and sinking." The victory electrified the American fleet. Cheers erupted across both Yorktown and Lexington. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States had destroyed a Japanese carrier. Spirits soared, but beneath the celebration, the officers knew the day was far from over. The main Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were still at large. They would strike back, and soon. While the Americans reveled in their triumph, the Japanese pilots attacking the misidentified Neosho and Sims finally arrived at their targets. Realizing too late they had been deceived, they unleashed their fury anyway. Bombs tore through the destroyer Sims, breaking her in two. The oiler Neosho was left crippled, her decks ablaze. Hundreds of sailors perished in the burning waters. The pilots returned to their fleet empty-handed but seething with vengeance. Night fell over the coral sea, heavy and humid. Both sides licked their wounds and prepared for what everyone knew was coming, the main carrier battle. Aboard the Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher conferred with his officers in the dimly lit chart room. Cigarette smoke coiled above them as voices murmured over maps. "Tomorrow," Fletcher said, "we face them head-on." There was no grand speech, no illusion of safety, just grim resolve. The morning of May 8th arrived with a pale, cold light. The wind had shifted. Visibility was clearer than any day before, a cruel gift to both fleets. Shortly after 8 a.m., reconnaissance reports confirmed the inevitable. Both Japanese and American carriers had found each other almost simultaneously. The orders went out at once. "Launch all planes." Engines roared to life across both fleets. Flight decks became war machines in motion, mechanics shouting, deckhands signaling with colored flags, pilots throttling up. Propellers whipped the air into screaming cyclones. From both the Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japanese Zero fighters rose like falcons. From Yorktown and Lexington, Wildcats and dauntless bombers clawed toward the sky. Within an hour, the two strike groups were racing toward each other, separated by only 100 miles of open ocean. In the thin blue air, the paths of death were set. At 10:57 a.m., the first American dive bombers sighted the Shokaku. The Japanese carrier zigzagged violently, trying to avoid the inevitable, but the Americans had trained for this. From high above, dive bombers folded their wings, plunging at terrifying speed through clouds of flak. The sound of the dive, the screaming descent, echoed like banshees across the sea. Bombs struck Shokaku's flight deck, tearing massive holes through steel and wood. Flames burst skyward as men scrambled for their lives. Simultaneously, the Japanese strike group reached the American carriers. From the sun's glare, their planes swooped in, torpedo bombers skimming the waves, fighters diving from above. The Lexington and Yorktown opened fire, their guns thundering. Tracers lit the sky in red and gold arcs. Explosions rocked the sea. 2 torpedoes slammed into the Lexington. The deck shuddered. Crewmen were thrown off their feet. Fire spread through the hangars, licking at fuel lines. Below deck, damage control parties fought the flames, choking on smoke. The ship's loudspeakers blared, "All hands to battle stations." Up above, Japanese Zeros tangled with Wildcats in vicious dogfights. Engines screamed, bullets shredded canvas, and planes burst into orange fireballs that spiraled into the waves. Pilots radioed frantic maydays before vanishing into the ocean's grasp. By noon, the battle had reached a fever pitch. Both sides bled in the sky. The Shokaku was crippled, her flight deck shattered and burning, but she remained afloat. The Lexington, beloved Lady Lex, was dying. Fuel vapors ignited, causing a massive explosion that tore through her lower decks. The ship lurched violently as sailors fought to contain the fires. Admiral Fletcher, aboard the Yorktown, watched in horror as plumes of black smoke engulfed Lexington. "She's not going to make it," a voice said beside him. Fletcher said nothing. He simply removed his cap, staring across the sea at his burning comrade. At 12:47 p.m., the order was given. Abandon ship. Boats were lowered into the churning waters as explosions continued to ripple through the Lexington. Pilots circled overhead, watching helplessly as their home sank beneath them. One final explosion split the great ship in two. Moments later, the Blue Ghost was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. Nearly 200 American sailors were dead. Hundreds more floated in life rafts, their eyes red from smoke and salt. Rescue ships pulled survivors from the water as oil fires burned around them, turning the sea into a black mirror of loss. But the cost was not in vain. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was halted. Their carriers were damaged beyond repair for months. Though both sides had lost heavily, the Japanese advance was stopped cold. As night fell, the Pacific was quiet again. Only the smell of fuel and the soft crackle of burning debris lingered. Pilots returned to their carriers exhausted, silent, haunted by the faces of friends who had not come back. On the Yorktown, a young mechanic sat beside the rail, staring into the dark water. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for peace. For the first time, two great powers had fought a naval battle without seeing each other's ships, their duel decided entirely by the eyes of pilots and the courage of men in the sky. The world had changed forever. The sea, once blue and endless, now carried the memory of fire. The Coral Sea, May 8, 1942. Dusk. The fire had faded, but the smoke still lingered, drifting across the waves like a funeral shroud. The once mighty Lexington was gone, swallowed by the deep. Her death throes echoed across the fleet, a reminder that victory and loss could share the same breath. The ocean that morning had been alive with fury. Now it lay still, reflecting a bruised sky streaked with ash and oil. On the surviving American carrier Yorktown, the decks were scarred and the crew exhausted. Men worked silently through the night, repairing the holes torn by bomb fragments and shrapnel. The acrid stench of burned paint and gasoline clung to every surface. Below deck, sailors tended to the wounded, men with bandaged faces, bloodied uniforms, trembling hands. The ship's doctor, his white coat now smeared with crimson, muttered prayers over the dying. In war, he thought, mercy came in short supply. Above, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the bridge, illuminated by the glow of signal lamps. Reports crackled over the radio, distorted by static and fatigue. The news was mixed. Japan's Shokaku was crippled, and the Zuikaku's air wing decimated, but their fleet still prowled the Coral Sea. Fletcher knew his force had been mauled. He also knew the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been stopped. Strategically, that was enough. Tactically, it had come at a terrible cost. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of distant engines. Lookouts strained their eyes toward the dark horizon, imagining enemy planes still lurking in the sky. But the attacks had ceased. The battle was over, or so it seemed. In truth, the fight for survival had just begun. As night deepened, the sea grew restless. Swells rocked the Yorktown, and every groan of metal sounded like a ghost from the depths. The ship's lights were dimmed to near darkness. Silence hung over the deck, broken only by the slap of waves against the hull. Sailors huddled together, speaking in whispers. "Think they'll come back?" one asked. "No," another replied, staring into the black water. "Not tonight, but they will, they always do." Across the sea, aboard the Japanese carrier Zuikaku, the mood was grim. Admiral Takagi's airmen returned battered, their ranks thinned by American flak and fighters. The once proud flight decks were littered with damaged aircraft, their fuselages riddled with holes, their pilots pale from exhaustion. Mechanic crews worked feverishly by lantern light to patch what they could. In the carrier's wardroom, Takagi read the latest situation report. Losses heavy, fuel running low, air groups shattered. "We cannot continue the invasion," he said softly. His officers nodded in solemn agreement. The Coral Sea, meant to be another victory, had turned into a costly stalemate. Meanwhile, in the cold Pacific night, rescue operations continued near where the Lexington had gone down. Destroyers swept through burning patches of oil, pulling survivors from the water. The men, coated in black soot and salt, clung to ropes with trembling hands. One sailor, half conscious, kept murmuring, "She went down fighting, she went down fighting," as medics lifted him aboard. For many, the sight of Lady Lex slipping beneath the waves would haunt them forever. Her sinking wasn't just the loss of a ship, it was the loss of a symbol. She had been the fleet's heart, her decks a home for thousands. As one survivor later wrote, "When she died, part of us went with her." By dawn, the sea was littered with debris. Life jackets, splintered rafts, twisted metal. The sun rose blood-red over the horizon, its reflection rippling across the wreckage. Seagulls circled overhead, drawn by the scent of oil and death. In the distance, the Yorktown's flag still fluttered weakly in the breeze, defiant amid the ruin. On her bridge, Admiral Fletcher issued his orders: regroup, withdraw to Noumea for repairs, preserve what remained of the fleet. The battle had been fought, and for the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese advance had been checked. The enemy would not reach Port Moresby. Australia would live to fight another day. But victory in the Coral Sea was not measured in triumph. It was measured in survival. Below deck, the pilots who had survived the fight sat in silence, their eyes hollow, their uniforms soaked in sweat and smoke. One of them, Lieutenant Red Mitchell, turned a battered dog tag over in his hand, the name of a friend who hadn't come back. "We got them good," he said quietly. Another pilot nodded. "Yeah, but they got us too." Outside, the ocean stretched endless and indifferent. The war would not end here. Even as the Yorktown limped southward for repairs, word reached Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. Japan was preparing another offensive, this time at a place called Midway. The Coral Sea had been the prologue to something far greater. Yet amid the machinery of war, human stories endured. On the Yorktown, Chief Petty Officer Daniels, the same mechanic who had whispered of the big one days before, stood by the rail watching the horizon. The air smelled of rain and oil. He thought of home, of fields far from this endless blue. His hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. He'd seen too much in too little time. Around him, the crew moved with quiet discipline, tending to the wounded, cleaning the deck, saying nothing. Each man carried his own ghosts now. In the Japanese fleet, silence hung heavy as well. Many pilots had not returned. In the cramped quarters of the Zuikaku, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi sat at his desk, writing in his logbook. His handwriting trembled as he recorded the losses, each name a small act of remembrance. "The sea has claimed many brave souls today," he wrote. "We fought well, but perhaps the gods of war have grown weary of us." The Coral Sea's waters became a cemetery, an unmarked graveyard stretching from horizon to horizon. Beneath the surface lay twisted planes, bombs that never detonated, and the bones of young men from both sides, now united in silence. As days passed, the full picture of the battle came into focus. Strategically, Japan had been halted. Their carrier strength was reduced. Their aura of invincibility cracked. For the Allies, it was a fragile but vital turning point. They had proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the empire that once seemed unstoppable. Back in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts who had first broken the Japanese codes received the battle reports. One young officer placed the final communique on his desk, staring at the words, "Japanese invasion of Port Moresby repelled." He exhaled slowly, knowing the cost of every syllable. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe we can win this." For the men still afloat in the Coral Sea, there was no time for reflection. They buried the dead at sea, wrapping each body in canvas, weighing it with shell casings. As the chaplain read the prayers, the ocean's wind drowned out his voice. One by one, the shrouded forms slid into the depths, claimed by the same sea that had witnessed their courage. The waves closed over them with quiet finality. At sunset, the Yorktown turned southward, her engines humming softly. Smoke drifted behind her like a trail of memory. In the officers' mess, coffee was poured, but few drank. Conversation was sparse. The men were thinking not of glory, but of the faces they would never see again. When darkness fell, the stars emerged over the Coral Sea, brilliant, cold, and countless. To the survivors looking up from the decks, they seemed both beautiful and cruel. The sky was eternal, untouched by the violence below. Yet it bore silent witness to all that had been lost. One sailor wrote in his journal that night, "We didn't win, but we didn't lose either. The sea took what it wanted, and we took what we could. Maybe that's all war really is." He closed the book and looked out over the black horizon, where lightning flickered in the distance. Another storm coming, another battle waiting. The Pacific was vast, but it had begun to change. For the first time, Japan's expansion had met resistance that would not break. The Coral Sea had burned, bled, and gone silent again. But its echo would carry across every wave, every island, every heart that still dared to fight. And far to the north, in the war rooms of Tokyo and Pearl Harbor alike, new plans were already being drawn. Both sides knew it. The next battle would decide the future of the Pacific. The shadow of Midway was rising. The Coral Sea was quiet now. The thunder of engines, the scream of dive bombers, the explosions that had turned the ocean into a blazing cauldron, all were gone. What remained was silence, broken only by the gentle slap of waves against twisted steel and the lonely cries of seabirds circling above. The battle that had raged for 4 relentless days was over. Yet its echoes stretched far beyond these waters, rippling across the Pacific, through the hearts of those who had survived and into the pages of history. For both sides, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a revelation. For Japan, it was the first time their advance had been stopped. For the United States, it was proof that the enemy could bleed. It was not a clear victory for either, but it marked a shift, a turning of the tides that no admiral, no nation could ignore. As the battered Yorktown limped into port at Noumea, her hull pockmarked with shrapnel and her deck scorched, the crew watched the shore draw near with disbelief. They had made it. Mechanics lined the dock, staring in awe at the wounded carrier. "She's still floating," one whispered. And somehow that alone felt like triumph. Inside the carrier's sickbay, the wounded lay in rows of cots. Bandages were soaked crimson, the air smelled of iodine and salt. A nurse moved between the bunks, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. She stopped beside a young pilot, his uniform burned. his eyes barely open. "Did we win?" he asked. She paused before answering. "You're still here. That's what matters." Thousands of miles away in Tokyo, the mood was not one of celebration. Admiral Takagi stood before a large map, tracing his finger over the Coral Sea. His fleet had inflicted damage, yes, but at a cost. Shokaku was crippled, Zuikaku's airmen were dead or grounded, and the invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. The Empire's southern advance had met its first wall. For the first time, whispers of uncertainty stirred in the Imperial Navy. The myth of invincibility had cracked. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied the same sea on his war map. Reports were scattered, losses heavy, yet there was a grim satisfaction in his voice when he spoke to his officers. "They've been stopped," he said, "and we'll stop them again." His gaze shifted toward the northwestern edge of the Pacific, a small island that intelligence had recently identified as Japan's next target. Its name, Midway. The Coral Sea had not delivered victory, but it had delivered something more vital, hope, and a glimpse of what lay ahead. In the weeks following the battle, war correspondents sent back reports filled with both pride and sorrow. Headlines read, "American and Japanese fleets clash in Pacific. Both sides claim victory." But those who were there knew the truth. There was no glory in what they had seen, only fire, courage, and the unbearable cost of survival. For the men who fought, the battle left scars deeper than steel. Many spoke little of what they'd witnessed, pilots who had watched their comrades fall from the sky, sailors who had clung to burning wreckage, officers who had given orders that sent men to their deaths, all carried the burden quietly. One survivor of the Lexington, a young gunner's mate named Harris, later wrote in his diary, "We fought for hours, but it felt like years. I can still smell the smoke. When the ship went under, we didn't cheer or cry. We just watched her go. The sea was calm again like nothing had happened, but I'll never forget the sound, the ship groaning as if she knew her time had come." The loss of the Lexington hit America hard. Newspapers called her Lady Lex, the gallant ghost. Her name became a rallying cry, her death a symbol of sacrifice. When newsreel footage of her burning decks reached American theaters, audiences sat in silence. Some wept, others clenched their fists. Across the Pacific, in small towns and big cities alike, people began to believe that victory, though far away, was possible. For Japan, the battle forced difficult questions. The Shokaku would spend months under repair. The Zuikaku, stripped of experienced pilots, could not sail for weeks. When Admiral Yamamoto began assembling his forces for the next great strike, two of his most powerful carriers were missing. That decision would haunt him at Midway, where Japan's fate would be decided. The Coral Sea had changed the rhythm of the war. It had proven that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would decide the future. No longer would fleets rely on heavy guns and armor. Now the war belonged to those who could dominate the skies. Every admiral, every strategist understood it. The era of the carrier had begun. Yet beyond the tactics and triumphs, the human cost endured. Families back home received telegrams edged in black. "We regret to inform you." The War Department's words were formal, unfeeling. Mothers read them in kitchens, fathers stared out at empty yards, brothers clenched the letters until the paper tore. The Pacific was vast, but its sorrow touched every shore. In Australia, the news that Port Moresby was safe brought relief and gratitude. The Japanese threat to the continent had been pushed back, if only temporarily. Prime Minister John Curtin spoke to the nation, calling the battle a moment of courage shared by all free peoples. But for the sailors who had watched friends vanish beneath the waves, the word courage felt hollow. They knew what it had cost. Weeks later, as repairs began on the Yorktown, engineers marveled at her resilience. Her flight deck was patched, her systems restored. She would sail again, just barely in time for Midway. Men worked around the clock, sleeping in short shifts, eating meals beside their tools. Every rivet, every weld, carried the weight of the coral sea. And as she left port once more, her hull still bearing the scars of battle, a sailor painted on her bulkhead 3 simple words. For Lady Lex, the Coral Sea had not been a clean victory. It was a draw written in fire and blood. But history would remember it as the battle that turned the tide. For the first time, the unstoppable Japanese Empire had been halted. For the first time, the Allies had stood their ground. The ocean itself seemed to know. Long after the last ships departed, the waves rolled gently over the wrecks below, silent witnesses to the courage of those who had fought here. Beneath the surface lay the remains of both sides, American Wildcats and Japanese Zeros, torpedoes rusting in the deep, the bones of young men who had once sworn loyalty to different flags but now rested together in the same eternal sea. Years later, when divers discovered the Lexington's wreck, they found her resting upright, her decks eerily preserved, her name still faintly visible. On her bridge, the wheel was frozen in place, as if still waiting for orders. Around her lay the ghosts of a generation, mute reminders of how far courage can carry a man and how deeply the ocean remembers. The Battle of the Coral Sea was not a tale of triumph or defeat. It was a story of endurance, of men standing against impossible odds, of loss and defiance intertwined. It marked the moment when the Pacific War changed course, when hope began to flicker amid the darkness. And though history would soon turn its gaze toward Midway, toward Guadalcanal, and toward the long road to Tokyo, the Coral Sea would remain the place where the tide first began to shift. In the end, no monument could truly capture what was lost here. Only the sea could hold it, the whispered prayers, the dying breaths, the courage of those who fought for a world they would never see. As the Pacific rolls on, its waves still wash over the graves of the men who made history. In May 1942, theirs was not a victory of conquest but of endurance. They faced the fire, they held the line, and in doing so they changed the course of the world. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.